At 6:17 on Monday morning, the most profitable division in Whitmore Distribution Group was less than 48 hours from triggering a default review that could cost it the customer that had helped make it number one. The executive conference room on the 12th floor was already full when Victoria Whitmore stepped through the glass doors, and for the first time in years, nobody stood when the CEO entered. There were two busy watching numbers turn red. A wall-mounted dashboard showed hundreds of delayed shipments across 3 states, warehouse backlogs climbing by the hour, emergency transportation costs rising, and service levels falling faster than anyone in the room had believed possible. Phones vibrated across the polished table. Emails arrived faster than they could be opened. Somewhere below them, dispatchers were calling carriers that had no trucks available. Warehouse supervisors were trying to find space for freight that should have left the night before, and customer service teams were apologizing to stores already running short. Victoria removed her coat without taking her eyes from the screen. "How bad is it?" she asked. CFO Robert Hayes looked down at the report in front of him. "Mercer Retail has given us 48 hours to restore service to the contractual threshold before they begin a formal default review." Victoria's expression hardened. Mercer was the division's largest account. Losing it would erase years of growth. What about the secondary carriers? No one answered immediately. The overflow warehouse. Still silence. Victoria turned toward Tyler Whitmore, her 29-year-old nephew, and the company's new senior vice president of operations. 5 weeks earlier, Tyler had walked into this same room with the confidence of a man who believed every problem could be solved by removing enough cost from a spreadsheet. Now his tie was loose, his face pale from a sleepless night, and 3 unopened energy drinks sat beside his laptop. "We're working on options," he said. Victoria stared at him. "That wasn't my question." Senior Operations Manager Laura Bennett finally spoke. The secondary carrier agreements were canceled. The overflow warehouse lease was terminated last month. Victoria looked at her as if she had spoken another language. "Who approved that?" Laura's eyes moved toward Tyler, then back to Victoria. Tyler did. A quiet pressure filled the room. Victoria crossed her arms. "Fine, get Daniel in here." Nobody moved. "I said get Daniel." Laura slowly closed the folder in front of her. She had worked beside Daniel Carter for almost 9 years. Long enough to recognize the exact moment a preventable problem became a crisis. "Daniel isn't here." Victoria's impatience sharpened. "Then call him." Robert looked away. Tyler stared at his laptop. Laura held Victoria's gaze. "He doesn't work here anymore." For several seconds, the only sound was the electronic chime of another warning appearing on the dashboard. "Victoria Froneth, what are you talking about?" Daniel's final day was 3 weeks ago. The word seemed to land harder than anyone expected. Victoria looked around the room as though someone might correct Laura. Nobody did. Daniel Carter had spent 14 years inside Whitmore Distribution Group. He had helped rebuild the division after a failed regional expansion, negotiated emergency transportation through 2 brutal winter seasons, redesigned warehouse procedures after a major customer nearly walked away, and created contingency plans so effective that most executives barely knew they existed. He was not flashy. He rarely spoke first in meetings. He did not collect allies in executive hallways or fill presentations with fashionable management language. Daniel was the person people called when something stopped working. And now, with the division unraveling, Victoria could not understand how the company had reached a moment when everyone suddenly needed the one man she had allowed to leave. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "You think this is connected to Daniel leaving?" Laura's face changed slightly. Not anger. Something closer to disbelief. "You know why he left?" Victoria said nothing. 5 weeks earlier, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, Daniel had walked into this same conference room carrying a worn leather notebook and believing Victoria had called him there to discuss the leadership position he had spent years earning. Instead, Victoria had introduced Tyler, praised his MBA, his consulting background, and his fresh approach to corporate growth. Then she had turned toward the 42-year-old single father who had spent more than a decade keeping her strongest operations steady and said the sentence that would eventually cost the company far more than she imagined. "You'll report to my nephew now." Daniel had looked at Victoria, then at Tyler, and quietly closed his notebook. Long before Whitmore Distribution Group learned how expensive Daniel Carter's absence could be, it had spent years mistaking his calm for something ordinary. Daniel arrived at the Regional Operations Center before 7 o'clock, most mornings, usually carrying the same black coffee and the same leather notebook he had used for years. He was 42, broad-shouldered, quietly observant, and rarely the loudest person in any room. He did not decorate his office with awards, even though his division had earned plenty. The only thing on his desk that mattered to him was a framed photograph of his 11-year-old daughter, Emma, smiling beside him at a county fair with powdered sugar on her cheek. Daniel had been raising her alone long enough to understand that life did not care how important a meeting seemed when a child needed to be picked up from school. At 4:45 most afternoons, he closed his laptop, checked the evening operations report, and drove 12 miles across town to get Emma from after-school care. Some younger executives quietly noticed that he left before they did. What they rarely saw was Daniel reopening his laptop at the kitchen table after Emma finished her homework and went to bed. At 9:30 at night, while the house was silent, he might be reviewing carrier capacity for an upcoming holiday weekend or checking whether a snow system moving across Nebraska could disrupt deliveries by morning. Daniel's value was difficult to measure because much of his best work looked like nothing happening. A truck arrived before a store ran out of inventory. A warehouse added 6 temporary workers before a backlog formed. A backup carrier was called before the primary carrier admitted it had a problem. A customer never knew how close a shipment had come to being late because Daniel had already rerouted it 12 hours earlier. Years before, after a winter storm trapped dozens of outbound loads, Daniel had created a regional carrier backup system. After another disruption nearly overwhelmed a distribution center, he built reserve staffing rules that activated before overtime became unsustainable and expensive. When a major retailer threatened to leave because of inconsistent deliveries, Daniel redesigned the escalation process so problems reached experienced managers before angry customers reached executives. None of it looked exciting on a quarterly presentation. It simply worked. Laura Bennett understood that better than most. She had watched Daniel step into problems that made other managers defensive and begin with the same question every time. What do we know for sure? He never started by asking who was responsible. He started by asking what needed to happen next. That was why warehouse supervisors called him before calling headquarters. It was why dispatch managers trusted him when weather forecasts turned ugly. It was why even Robert Hayes, the cautious CFO who questioned almost every operating expense, rarely challenged Daniel when he said a backup contract needed to remain in place. Daniel did not spend money casually. He simply remembered what failure cost. Still, none of that made him feel financially secure. He had a mortgage, Emma's school expenses, health insurance, and a college savings account that was growing more slowly than he wanted. He knew exactly what his paycheck meant because there was no second income waiting at home. One Thursday morning, Emma sat across from him eating cereal while Daniel packed her lunch. "Are you coming to science night next month?" she asked. Daniel looked up. "Wouldn't miss it." She narrowed her eyes playfully. "You said that about the fall concert." Daniel winced. A shipment crisis in St. Louis had kept him at work until nearly 9 that night. "Fair point," he said. "Then I owe you one." Emma smiled. "2." Daniel laughed, zipped her lunch bag, and promised himself he would make it this time. 2 hours later, he was standing over a conference table studying a staffing forecast when an email appeared on his phone. The subject line read leadership. Restructuring discussion. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 3 p.m. with Victoria Whitmore herself. Daniel read it twice. For nearly 2 years, colleagues had quietly suggested that if the company ever created a senior leadership role over the division, it would almost certainly go to him. He had never asked Victoria directly. He believed results should speak before ambition did. That afternoon, Laura stopped at his office door and noticed him putting his leather notebook into his briefcase. "Big meeting?" she asked. Daniel gave a small shrug, but she could see the hope he was trying not to show. "Maybe." Laura smiled. 14 years, Daniel. If anyone earned that seat, you did. Daniel glanced at Emma's photograph before switching off his office light. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to imagine that loyalty, patience and competence might finally lead somewhere. At 2:58, he walked toward the executive conference room, believing he was about to discuss the promotion he had spent years earning. He knew he had been wrong the moment he saw a stranger sitting in the chair everyone had quietly assumed would become his. Tyler Whitmore stood as Daniel entered, straightened the sleeve of an expensive navy suit, and offered a polished smile that looked practiced without being unfriendly. At 29, Tyler carried himself with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously before he had been tested by consequences. Victoria sat at the head of the conference table with a presentation glowing on the screen behind her. "Daniel, good," she said. "I want you to meet Tyler." Daniel shook the younger man's hand. "Nice to meet you." "Likewise," Tyler said. "I've heard a lot about what you've built here." The sentence sounded respectful, but something about the room had already changed. Daniel placed his leather notebook on the table and took the seat across from them. Victoria began with Tyler's resume. MBA from Northwestern. 4 years in management consulting. 2 years advising logistics and retail companies on cost transformation, automation, and growth strategy. Tyler had worked on national accounts and presented to executive boards. None of that was meaningless. Daniel understood numbers well enough to recognize that Tyler was educated, articulate, and probably very good at explaining what an operation should look like on paper. What Tyler had never done was run one when weather shut down an interstate, when 40 employees called out during flu season, or when a carrier promised 20 trucks and delivered 11. Victoria clicked to the next slide. "We've reached the point where this division needs a broader strategic direction," she said. "We can't keep managing for yesterday's problems." Daniel kept his expression neutral. "What does the new structure look like?" Victoria glanced toward Tyler. "Tyler is joining us as Senior Vice President of Operations." Daniel felt something tighten behind his ribs, but his voice stayed steady. "And my role? You'll remain Director of Operations. Your responsibilities are important, but Tyler will oversee the division and report directly to me." For a moment, Daniel heard nothing except the faint hum of the projector. 14 years. Missed dinners. Christmas Eve calls. Storm plans built at 2 in the morning. Customers saved before senior leadership even knew there was a problem. He had never believed time alone entitled him to promotion, but he had believed performance deserved consideration. "Was I considered?" Daniel asked. Victoria leaned back. "Daniel, you are excellent at operations." He waited. She continued. "But this next stage requires a different kind of leadership. Tyler brings strategic experience, outside perspective, and the ability to modernize how we think." The words landed more deeply than if she had simply told him no. Excellent at operations. Useful enough to keep the machine running, apparently, but not enough to decide where it should go. "I see," Daniel said. Tyler leaned forward. "For what it's worth, I'm not coming in here pretending I know everything you know. I want us working closely." Daniel studied him and realized Tyler meant it. That almost made the situation worse. The problem was not that Victoria had hired a fool. The problem was that she had decided 14 years of proven judgment mattered less than a strong resume combined with a family connection. "I'll work professionally with whoever the company puts in the role," Daniel said. Victoria smiled as though the difficult part was over. It was not. The next morning, Tyler arrived at Daniel's office carrying a thin binder and a laptop. "I've been going through the numbers," he said. "Your service metrics are excellent. Best in the company. They've taken years to stabilize." "Exactly, which means we have room to optimize." Tyler turned the laptop around. A chart showed transportation, staffing, inventory, and warehouse expenses. Victoria wants 12% out of operating costs in 60 days. Daniel looked at him. 12% across the division. Tyler pointed to several highlighted lines. Backup carrier retainers. Reserve labor. Overflow storage. Inventory buffers. There's a lot of duplication here. Daniel looked at the numbers for several seconds. Every highlighted cost represented a problem somebody had once paid dearly to learn from. "Those aren't duplicates," he said. "They're contingencies." Tyler smiled slightly. "Every department says that about its costs." Daniel closed the laptop halfway and pushed it gently back across the desk. You can cut 12%. Tyler's smile returned, as though he had just one agreement. Then Daniel finished the sentence. You just won't like what disappears with it. The moment Daniel realized Victoria valued his judgment only when it supported Tyler's plan, the job he had spent 14 years protecting became something he could no longer recognize. For the next 2 days, he did exactly what Victoria expected of him. He gave Tyler full access to the division, answered every question, opened every operating report, and walked him through the systems that had kept service stable when competitors were missing deliveries. Daniel did not sulk. He did not withhold information. If Tyler was going to lead the operation, Daniel wanted him to understand what he was touching. They started with transportation. Daniel showed him why the division paid modest monthly retainers to 2 secondary carriers even when their trucks were rarely used. 3 winters ago, our primary carrier lost almost a third of its capacity during a storm system across Iowa and Nebraska, Daniel explained. These 2 companies covered the gap before our customers felt it. Tyler studied the figures. And since then, we've used them 4 times. 4 times in 3 years. 4 times when we needed them. Tyler made a note. Next came reserve labor. Daniel explained that several experienced warehouse workers were scheduled with flexible hours during peak periods so managers could increase staffing before backlog formed. Tyler saw idle capacity. Daniel saw insurance. Then they reviewed regional inventory buffers that prevented stores from running empty when shipments were delayed. After that came the overflow warehouse 12 miles from the main distribution center, an unremarkable building Tyler had already identified as an expensive lease with low average utilization. We use 30% of it most months, Tyler said. Correct. Then why are we paying for 100%? Daniel turned toward him. Because when that building reaches 100%, the main warehouse is usually already in trouble. Tyler leaned back. That's a lot of money for something that might happen. Daniel nodded. It is. Then he pointed to the service report. That's also one reason this number stays above 98%. Tyler was quiet for a moment, but Daniel could see the disagreement had not changed. By Wednesday afternoon, Tyler sent a proposed reduction plan to senior leadership. It cut reserve staffing, reduced inventory buffers, terminated the overflow warehouse lease, and began eliminating the backup carrier retainers. The projected savings were impressive. The discussion of risk was not. Daniel read the document twice, then opened a blank file. He spent nearly 3 hours writing an operational risk assessment in plain language. No acquiescence, no emotion. He documented what could happen if multiple safeguards disappeared at once. Carrier disruption could become shipment delay. Shipment delay, combined with reduced inventory, could become customer shortages. Shortages combined with thinner staffing could create a backlog the main warehouse would have nowhere to reroute. At the bottom, Daniel wrote one sentence carefully. These recommendations may reduce short-term costs, but implementing them simultaneously materially increases the division's exposure to service failure. He sent the memo to Tyler and Victoria. 20 minutes later, Victoria called him upstairs. She was standing beside the window when he entered, the city spread below her in late afternoon sunlight. His memo lay printed on her desk. What exactly were you trying to accomplish with this? She asked. Document the operational risk. Tyler already knows you disagree with the plan. This isn't about disagreement. Then why copy me? Daniel paused. Because if we remove several layers of protection at the same time, leadership should understand the consequences. Victoria's jaw tightened. Do you realize how this looks? I'm less concerned with how it looks than with what could happen. Maybe you should be concerned with both. She stepped closer to the desk. Tyler has been here less than a week, and instead of helping him execute, you're creating a paper trail explaining why he might fail. Daniel stared at her. I'm creating a record of risks before we take them. That's part of my job. Your job is also to support leadership. Support doesn't mean pretending risk isn't there. The room went still. Daniel thought about his mortgage, health insurance, Emma's college account, the science night he had promised not to miss. He knew exactly how much he could lose by pushing further. Victoria folded her arms. I need this to be very clear. You'll report to my nephew. If you can't accept that, I need to know now. Daniel looked at the woman he had worked for most of his adult life, then at the memo she had barely considered. Something inside him became unexpectedly calm. He closed the folder in his hands. Then you know now. Daniel's resignation shocked the people around him for one reason more than any other. He did not leave angry. He left prepared. At 7:12 the next morning, Victoria opened an email with the subject resignation and transition plan. Daniel's letter was less than a page. He thanked the company for 14 years, confirmed that his decision was final, and offered to complete a professional transition of every major responsibility under his control. There were no accusations, no threats, no mention of Tyler's promotion. Victoria read it twice, then called Daniel into her office. "You're serious," she said. "Yes. You're willing to walk away from 14 years over one disagreement." Daniel met her eyes. "It isn't one disagreement." Victoria waited, but he did not argue further. He had already learned that explaining the same risk more loudly would not make someone more willing to hear it. "I'll give 2 weeks," he said. "I'll document everything, transfer vendor relationships, and make sure Laura and the supervisors have what they need." Victoria leaned back. "And then I leave." For the next 10 business days, Daniel worked harder than anyone expected from a man who had already decided to go. He built a transition binder nearly 3 inches thick. It contained carrier contacts, escalation procedures, seasonal staffing triggers, customer-specific requirements, warehouse overflow plans, emergency routing options, and a calendar showing exactly when inventory buffers needed to increase before holiday demand. He added notes explaining not just what each safeguard did, but why it existed. He met individually with dispatch, warehouse, transportation, and customer service leaders. He walked Laura through unresolved risks and showed her where every contingency document was stored. He even scheduled 2 full afternoons with Tyler. "These are the secondary carrier agreements," Daniel said, sliding a folder across the table. "If primary capacity drops more than 15%, call both before you start buying trucks on the spot market." Tyler looked through the contracts. "That seems aggressive. It's cheaper to reserve capacity early than panic buy it later." Tyler nodded, though Daniel could not tell whether he agreed. Daniel kept going anyway. He was not trying to prove a point anymore. He was trying to leave the people below him with a fighting chance. Word of his resignation spread through the division faster than he wanted. Supervisors stopped by his office. Dispatchers shook his hand. One warehouse manager who had worked with Daniel for 11 years simply said, "This place is going to feel different." Daniel smiled faintly. Different doesn't have to mean worse. On his final afternoon, Laura closed his office door behind her. Most of Daniel's shelves were empty now. Emma's framed photograph sat beside the cardboard box on his desk. "3 people asked me today whether you're going to another company," Laura said. "I'm not going anywhere yet. And if some of us wanted to go with you?" Daniel's expression changed immediately. "Don't." Laura looked surprised. "Daniel, I mean it. Don't turn this into a war. After what they did to you, this isn't about what they did to me." He glanced through the glass toward the operations floor. "There are hundreds of people here with mortgages, kids, health insurance, lives. They need this place to work." Laura looked down. "What if Tyler tears apart everything you built?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "He gets to make his choices. Your job is to protect the people working under you." Laura nodded toward the thick transition binder. "And what if they call you when it goes bad?" Daniel picked up Emma's photograph and placed it carefully into the box. "They have everything they need in that binder." At 5:26, Daniel carried the box through the lobby he had crossed thousands of times. No dramatic farewell waited for him. No security. Escort. No final confrontation. Laura hugged him near the elevators. Robert Hayes shook his hand and said quietly, "For what it's worth, I think they're making a mistake." Daniel answered, "I hope you're wrong." Then he walked into the parking garage, placed the box in the back seat of his SUV, and drove away. That evening, he made it home before 6. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, working on a cardboard model for science night. She looked up when he came through the door. "You're early." Daniel smiled. "Looks that way." For the first time in years, there was no company laptop in his bag. 1 week later, Tyler presented the first full operating report since Daniel's departure. Transportation costs were down. Labor expense was down. Warehouse spending had fallen sharply. The division had posted its strongest short-term operating margin in nearly 2 years. Victoria looked across the executive table at her nephew and smiled. For one dangerous moment, it seemed Daniel Carter had been wrong about everything. Over the following week, nearly every number on Tyler Whitmore's dashboard seemed determined to reinforce that belief. Transportation expenses continued falling. Overtime remained lower. The overflow warehouse was gone, saving thousands of dollars a week, and Tyler canceled one of the 2 backup carrier agreements before terminating the second. Inventory levels were trimmed across the network, freeing up cash that had been tied up on warehouse shelves. Tyler stood in front of the executive team with a polished presentation showing green arrows, declining expenses, and stronger margins. "We were carrying too much protection against problems that rarely happen," he said. "We're simply running leaner." Victoria looked around the table with unmistakable satisfaction. "This is exactly the kind of discipline we needed." Robert did not argue, but he kept studying the service data near the bottom of the report. Nothing had broken yet. That made arguing against the savings difficult. Laura felt the same uneasiness from the operations floor. On paper, Tyler's changes looked brilliant. In practice, she could feel the margin for error shrinking around them. Weekend staffing was thinner. Warehouse aisles filled faster before trailers could be unloaded. Dispatch managers had fewer options when a driver called out or a truck arrived late. None of those things was a crisis. Not yet. Tyler took the early results as permission to move faster. He reduced reserve labor again and lowered inventory targets at several high-volume locations. Then he ended the final backup carrier retainer. "We could buy capacity when we need it," he told Laura. "Why pay every month for trucks that spend most of the year somewhere else?" Laura remembered Daniel's warning about the spot market. Because when everyone needs trucks at the same time, there may not be any to buy. Tyler gave her a patient smile. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we're trying to modernize." Across town, Daniel had problems of a different kind. For the first time since his 20s, he woke on Monday mornings without a company waiting for him. He had enough savings to cover several months, but every ordinary expense suddenly felt louder. The mortgage payment, groceries, Emma's braces appointment coming in the fall, the automatic transfer into her college account. Daniel had interviewed with 2 companies, but neither position felt right. One offered more money but expected constant travel. The other wanted someone to inherit an operation with almost no authority to change it. Daniel had already spent too many years being responsible for outcomes without always being given the authority he needed. He was not eager to repeat that mistake. One evening, Emma found him at the kitchen table staring at his laptop while a job posting remained untouched on the screen. "You okay?" she asked. Daniel looked up. "Yeah." She sat across from him. "You have the face." "What face?" "The one where you say you're fine, but you're doing math in your head." Daniel laughed despite himself. Emma had known him too long. "I'm just figuring things out." She hesitated. "Do you think you made a mistake?" The question caught him off guard because he had been quietly asking himself the same thing. Whitmore's margins were up. Tyler was being praised. Maybe Daniel had confused caution with wisdom. Maybe some safeguards he had defended really had become expensive habits from older problems. He looked at his daughter and chose not to pretend certainty he did not have. "I think I made the decision I could live with," he said. "That doesn't mean it was easy." Emma nodded, then pushed a folded flyer across the table. It was for her science night. "You're still coming, right?" Daniel smiled. Front row. Back at Whitmore, the green numbers continued for another 4 days. Then, at 8:43 Thursday night, Laura received an email from one of the division's primary carriers. She read the first line once, then again. Due to an unexpected regional equipment shortage combined with driver availability problems, the carrier was reducing committed capacity effective immediately. By morning, Whitmore would be short dozens of trucks. Laura opened the transportation contingency file Daniel had left behind and reached for the phone. Then she stopped. Both backup agreements were gone. By noon the next day, Whitmore was no longer dealing with a single transportation problem. It was watching years of carefully built protection fail in the exact sequence Daniel had warned it could. Laura had started calling carriers before sunrise, but the spot market was already tightening across the region. Other distributors had been hit by the same equipment shortage, and available trucks were disappearing by the hour. The first quote Laura received was 38% above Whitmore's normal contracted rate. The second was worse. By 7:30 a.m., Tyler authorized emergency purchases anyway. "Get the freight moving," he told her. "We can absorb the cost for a few days." But freight was only the first problem. Because Tyler had reduced inventory buffers, several high-volume customers had less product on hand than they normally carried. Delays that once would have been absorbed quietly now reached distribution centers and store replenishment schedules almost immediately. By Friday afternoon, 17 locations tied to Whitmore's largest retail customer were reporting shortages or missed replenishment windows. Tyler ordered the warehouse to accelerate outbound loads. The supervisors tried, but reserve labor had been cut, and the remaining crews were already working overtime. Inbound freight began arriving faster than teams could unload it, while outbound trailers waited for orders that were not ready. Pallets filled the staging lanes. Then the main warehouse reached capacity. Laura called Tyler from the floor. "We need overflow space tonight." Tyler hesitated. "Use temporary storage." "Where?" "Find something local." Laura closed her eyes for a second. The overflow warehouse Daniel had kept 12 miles away was now leased to another company. By Saturday morning, Whitmore was paying premium rates for scattered short-term storage at 3 different facilities, none of them fully connected to the company's normal warehouse systems. Orders had to be transferred manually between locations. Mistakes multiplied. One shipment went to the wrong distribution point. Another left incomplete. Customer service calls climbed into the hundreds. The savings Tyler had celebrated only days earlier were disappearing with stunning speed. Yet the most important truth was becoming clear. Daniel had never been the single piece holding the division together. He had built layers so that no single failure could bring it down. Backup trucks existed because carriers sometimes failed. Inventory buffers existed because trucks sometimes arrived late. Reserve workers existed because warehouses sometimes surged. Overflow capacity existed because several pressures could still arrive at once. Tyler had looked at each layer separately and seen waste. He had never considered what happened when all of them were removed together. By Sunday evening, Laura had been awake for nearly 20 hours with only brief breaks. Tyler stood beside her in the operations center, watching a dashboard filled with late orders. "How long until we catch up?" he asked. Laura gave him a tired look. "If nothing else goes wrong?" "Yes. 3 or 4 days." Tyler exhaled. "That's manageable." Laura did not answer. At 9:14 p.m., an account director hurried across the floor, carrying his phone. "We have a problem." Tyler turned. "What now?" "Mercer Retail." Everyone nearby went quiet. Mercer represented the division's largest contract, hundreds of stores across the Midwest, and more annual revenue than several smaller customers combined. "They've documented repeated service failures since Thursday," the account director said. "Their regional distribution centers are missing scheduled replenishment." Tyler rubbed his forehead. "Tell them we're recovering." "I did." "And?" The man held out his phone. Their legal team sent a formal cure notice. Laura felt her stomach tighten before he even finished. The contract contained performance protections Daniel had reviewed every quarter. Miss enough service commitments, and Mercer could require Whitmore to cure the failures within a defined period before initiating a default review. "How much time?" Laura asked. 48 hours from receipt. If service isn't restored to the contractual threshold, they begin the review process. Tyler stared at the dashboard. Emergency trucking was costing more every hour. The warehouse was buried in backlog. Temporary storage was creating new errors. There was no reserve staff left to call, no overflow building to open, and no backup carrier under contract. For the first time since taking the job, Tyler stopped talking about optimization. Across town, Daniel was sitting in the front row of Emma's school auditorium, watching her explain a small electric motor she had built for science night. His phone remained silent in his pocket. Back at Whitmore, Laura opened the transition binder Daniel had left behind. On one page, under a section titled Major Customer Service Failure, he had written the recovery sequence step by step. Every step still made sense. Several of them depended on resources Tyler had already eliminated. Then Laura noticed the date on Daniel's risk memo clipped behind the section. She looked at Tyler and said quietly, "We need Victoria here first thing tomorrow morning." Tyler's face tightened. "Why?" Laura turned the document toward him. "Because Daniel told us exactly how this could happen." At 6:17 Monday morning, the crisis Victoria had first seen as a transportation emergency became something much harder to explain. A leadership failure documented weeks before it happened. She stood at the head of the executive conference table with Tyler, Laura, Robert, and 3 division leaders facing her. No coffee had been touched. The dashboard behind them showed late shipments multiplying across the Midwest, emergency transportation costs climbing, and Mercer's service level falling farther below contract requirements. Victoria dropped her folder onto the table. "I want facts," she said, "not excuses. What happened?" Tyler answered first. The carrier shortage hit faster than anyone expected. Regional capacity tightened, and we had simultaneous warehouse pressure. It was an unusual combination. Laura said nothing. Robert opened his notebook. Victoria looked at Tyler. "Can Mercer be stabilized before the cure period expires?" "We're pushing every available resource." "That wasn't my question." Tyler hesitated. "I can't guarantee it." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Then show me what Daniel said." The room went silent. Laura placed a printed copy of Daniel's operational risk assessment in front of her. Victoria recognized it immediately. 5 weeks earlier, she had read barely half of it before deciding Daniel was trying to undermine Tyler. Now she started the first page and did not stop. Carrier concentration risk, reduced inventory protection, lower reserve staffing, loss of overflow warehouse capacity, increased exposure if several safeguards were removed simultaneously. Each warning was written without emotion, followed by a practical consequence. Victoria turned the page. "When was this sent?" "Before the cuts were fully implemented," Laura said. "And Tyler received it?" "Yes." Victoria looked toward her nephew. "You read this?" Tyler shifted in his chair. "I reviewed it. I disagreed with the assumptions." "Which assumptions?" "That several problems would hit at the same time." Laura finally spoke. "That's what contingency planning is for." Tyler turned toward her. "We had years of data showing those resources were underused because they were backups." Victoria raised one hand, and in the argument, Robert slid another report across the table. "There's more." Tyler's expression changed. Robert continued. "Service performance began deteriorating Thursday morning. Customer complaints were elevated by Thursday afternoon. The operating systems recorded it in real time, but the executive escalation didn't happen until Sunday." Victoria slowly turned toward Tyler. "Why?" "We were working the backlog. I expected the recovery actions to correct the numbers before this reached the executive level. So you delayed escalating the deterioration?" "I wanted to give the recovery plan time to work." Robert's voice remained calm. "The problem is that senior leadership lost nearly 3 days of decision time." Victoria stared at Tyler for several seconds. Until that moment, she had been able to tell herself the crisis was the result of bad timing. A carrier problem, a difficult market, a young executive learning under pressure. But delaying escalation because the numbers might improve was different. That was not simply inexperience. That was judgment. "Leave the room," she said. Tyler blinked. "Victoria, leave?" He looked around the table, perhaps expecting someone to defend him. Nobody did. He closed his laptop and walked out. The door shut softly behind him. Victoria looked back at Daniel's memo. "How much of this can we reverse?" Laura answered carefully. "Some of it, but not quickly. The overflow warehouse is leased. The former backup carriers are committed elsewhere. We can rebuild temporary capacity, but Mercer's clock is already running." "What would Daniel do?" Laura glanced at Robert. "He'd start by protecting the customer, not the margin. He'd prioritize. Mercer loads, pay for capacity where necessary, restore inventory at the most exposed distribution centers, and separate recovery freight from normal operations. Victoria looked at the transition binder beside Laura. Then why aren't we doing that? We are, Laura said. But Daniel built that recovery sequence, assuming those backup resources still existed. We can reproduce the decisions. We can't instantly recreate the capacity. Victoria leaned back, and for the first time since the crisis began, the room saw something other than authority on her face. Regret. I knew why Daniel left, she said quietly. I just never understood what dismissing him would cost us. No one answered. Robert closed his notebook. The board is meeting at noon. They'll want to know why the highest performing division in the company lost this much operational resilience in a matter of weeks. Victoria looked through the glass wall toward employees moving rapidly across the operations floor below. Hundreds of people were trying to repair decisions made by a handful of executives above them. She picked up her phone and scrolled to Daniel Carter's number. Laura watched her thumb hover over the screen. What are you going to say? 5 weeks earlier, Victoria had told Daniel he would report to her nephew. Now her nephew had been sent out of the room. Mercer was approaching the end of its cure period, and several systems Daniel had spent years protecting were gone. Victoria pressed call. For the first time, she said quietly, I'm going to listen. By the time Victoria Whitmore finally asked Daniel Carter to come back, he no longer needed the job, the title, or even the apology he had once thought would matter. Her call came at 6:31 that same Monday morning. Daniel was pouring coffee when his phone lit up with her name. He watched it ring twice before answering. Daniel. Victoria's voice was different from the one he remembered. I need to talk to you. He said nothing. Mercer issued a formal cure notice. The operation is unstable. Tyler has been removed from control of the division, and I've read your risk assessment again. Daniel looked toward the hallway where Emma was still asleep. Laura has the transition binder. I know. Victoria Post. I'm not calling because the binder isn't good enough. I'm calling because my judgment wasn't. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. 5 weeks earlier, that sentence might have given him satisfaction. Now it only made him tired. What do you need? An hour. In person. He agreed to meet that afternoon, but he made one thing clear. I'm not agreeing to come back. At 3 o'clock, Daniel entered a quiet conference room near Whitmore headquarters. Victoria was already there without an assistant, without Tyler, and without the polished certainty she usually carried into every meeting. A copy of Daniel's memo rested on the table between them. You warned us, she said. I did, and I decided you were resisting change. Daniel remained silent. Victoria looked down at the memo. I confused loyalty to my family with judgment about my company. I gave Tyler authority he had not earned here. And when you challenged the risk, I treated your experience like an obstacle. She looked back at him. I was wrong. Daniel had imagined hearing those words during more than one sleepless night after resigning. Strangely, now that they had arrived, he did not feel victorious. What happens to the people in the division? He asked. We're rebuilding capacity. Laura is running the recovery. Robert authorized whatever reasonable spending she needs. Mercer has agreed to hold off on a final decision while we stabilize service, but will pay penalties and operate under stricter performance terms if they stay. Good. Victoria slid a folder toward him. Come back as Executive Vice President of Operations. Full authority over the division. Direct reporting line to me. Higher compensation. Tyler will have no operational authority. Daniel did not open the folder. That would have meant a lot to me 5 weeks ago. Victoria understood immediately. You accepted something else? Chief Operating Officer at Ridgeway Logistics. Victoria's expression tightened slightly. Ridgeway was a smaller regional competitor, but it had been expanding steadily across the Midwest. This morning, the offer gave Daniel something he had spent years waiting for at Whitmore. Authority that matched responsibility. It also limited overnight travel and protected 2 evenings each week so he could be fully present for Emma. Victoria leaned back slowly. Is there anything I can offer that changes your mind? Daniel thought about the question carefully. No, he did not say it cruelly. That was what made it final. I'll answer Laura's questions about the transition documents if she needs clarification. I don't want the people they're paying for decisions they didn't make. "But I'm not coming back." Victoria nodded, the disappointment on her face mixed with something Daniel had rarely seen from her before: humility. Whitmore survived the crisis, but survival was not the same as escaping consequences. Mercer retained most of its business only after Whitmore accepted financial penalties, stricter service requirements, and months of executive oversight. Two smaller customers moved their accounts elsewhere. The division lost its #1 profitability ranking, fell sharply, and spent the next year rebuilding the safeguards Tyler had removed in weeks. Tyler was permanently removed from operational leadership and reassigned away from decisions affecting the division. Under pressure from the board, Victoria established independent review requirements for senior appointments and formal conflict of interest rules for family members. Laura was promoted to lead the recovery, and Robert gained greater oversight of major restructuring decisions. Daniel watched most of it from a distance. 6 months later, he left Ridgway's office on a Tuesday at 4:30 and drove directly to Emma's school. No emergency call interrupted him. No executive meeting kept him late. Emma climbed into the SUV carrying a backpack and a half-finished poster board. As Daniel pulled away from the curb, she looked at him. "Do you ever miss Whitmore?" Daniel thought about 14 years of mornings before sunrise, people he respected, crises solved, and a conference room where someone had finally decided his experience had a ceiling. "I miss some people there," he said. Emma waited. Daniel smiled and turned toward home. "That's not the same thing."